Thank you very much, Lynn. It's a pleasure to come back and pick up on that, plus that carryover question from the last time. And this one will be a program I have to demonstrate that idea that Alan Murray talked about of weaning oneself away from PowerPoints. I have 2 slides today. And this one's just going back to that MIT forecast of 2010 on the build of 5 of the major sources of gas supply that we had at that time, and recognize that when you have a new supply show up like that, it's a powerful incentive for developing new ways to use it. And certainly in the early stages of this, it's been the dramatic impact that that supply, which is within the industry, there are many who say, I didn't believe we'd go ahead and do what we've done in the past, which is create this incredible gas glut that drives prices down, and we create this massive oversupply. But lo and behold, that is in fact what's been done, and it's created, number one, a powerful incentive, obviously, within one industry. I'm going to talk about just a few things here. The focus will be on manufacturing and in the industrial side, but I think it's worthwhile just recognizing a little bit out of order what's happened with the utilities. It wasn't all that long ago that 52% of our electricity was generated by coal, and as I recall the number, natural gas was down around 20%. But what's really come on is with the environmental issues associated with coal, and they were touched on by Fred, among others, earlier today. The contributions to pollution are not just CO2, not just methane emissions if there's fugitive leaks, but also mercury and oxides and so on. So there are a whole lot of issues that needed to be addressed and are being expected to be addressed by the regulators, led by the EPA, such that the utility industry has come to realize that the most effective way to go is to increase that use of natural gas in the stream. And we've gone from 52% down to the low 40s. Now we're now below 40 into the high 38% range, and probably on our way, I suspect, to something in the low 30s, possibly the high 20% component for coal during the balance of this decade. And that has a number of knock-on effects after that, because it does enhance the environmental compliance, and it also, by virtue of a different view of gas today than one that was held in the late 70s, the 80s, or even the 90s, about the undependability of future supply. It's pretty clear that if we address the issues that were talked about by myself and others earlier today, the dependability of natural gas supply in North America, and in the US in particular, is going to be very high. And therefore, the incentive to figure out where else it can be used most effectively and most economically is there. One of the leading candidates, one of the early beneficiaries, if you will, are the petrochemical industries, the direct manufacturers of ethylene and the products that derive from an ethylene stream. And that is a really interesting thing for me to have observed, because if you go back only a decade, the petrochemical industry in this country was viewed as a industry with a limited expected lifespan. I remember personally conversations that were going on between owners of ethylene plants on the Gulf Coast of Texas with overseas parties, primarily in Asia, and you can guess the names, where the notion was, we'll come to your country with a barge, load up, dismantle your ethylene plant, take it to our locations in Asia, reinstall it, and with our cost advantage on labor, that's the place where the competitive advantage will continue to exist. And one of my near last visits with a client with a major super one of the super major oil companies, big in the petrochemical business, was one in which they were remarking on how they went from this notion of a dead-end future for petrochemicals in the U.S. To the rejuvenation that had occurred, in no small part because the recognition was much of our petrochemical industry was in a position where they had built it mostly to run on natural gas and ethane, and not to run on gas oil. Whereas most of Europe, a good chunk of Europe, was oriented to the gas oil derivatives, which were tied much more closely to the price of oil, with a 4-to-1 differential on pricing. Natural gas in the U.S. at least at a $20 to $24 per barrel equivalent price and $100 oil. The differential is huge, and while over time there may be some form of convergence, it does appear to be way out before that will happen. So the petrochemical sector is a big early beneficiary. It's already happening, but most importantly, once you've determined that you're going to have a long-term outlook for the manufacture of ethylene in this country, you then start saying, all right, what do we do beyond that? And I was struck just last week with somewhere I came across an ad where somebody's talking about these American-made carpets. And American-made, they're all American-made, and it was quite clear that it was an ethylene-derived product that is part of this, and so that's way downstream from the new confidence that ethylene manufacture in the U.S. is already now, and can be sustained in a very competitive way, looking well out into the future. Obviously things can come along to change this, but if you've got a 10 to 20 year time frame, that's a real change of viewpoint from what we had a decade ago. Fertilizer is another segment that is becoming a beneficiary, and to put this in context, fertilizer manufacturing in the U.S. was quite normal in the 70s and 80s, but a combination of fear of running out of gas and periodic high prices for gas caused the fertilizer industry to go through quite a transformation in which for a long time there was a process of many fertilizer plants shutting down and moving offshore to areas where there was stranded natural gas for the manufacture of ammonia and its integration into the fertilizer manufacturing. Trinidad was a good example of that, and other areas where there was stranded gas became the favored spot. This was even before the notion of moving stranded gas to relevant markets with LNG became popularized. Today, it's quite different. By virtue of the widespread nature of gas availability, which you could see on the chart of shale gas availability that I showed earlier, the re-establishment of fertilizer manufacturing in this country, close to market, where the transportation costs and the logistics of getting it to market also enter into the equation, is quite evident. So we're seeing those kind of downstream effects. The most interesting to me is what may follow these early effects that are already showing up, and that relates mostly to the manufacturing sector. And in this area, what I talked about in the utilities is important because, in a way, you can think of the portion of electricity that is generated from natural gas that's really just a way of delivering the gas. In a way, it's an intermediary. It's not an independent source, if you will, and so you've got an overlap to take into account. But I believe the combination of the favorable effect of more natural gas in electricity generation and its ability to bring the most cost-effective technique we've got available today to ensure environmental compliance gives us a cost advantage on electricity that we wouldn't otherwise have. And that combined with using natural gas in various forms of metal, the metal processing and manufacturing becomes an intriguing set of opportunities where the degree of innovation, I think, will bubble up, and I suspect we'll find in this conference next year or the year after things that we're not even imagining today that are real examples of that. And but what hit me today was I would put out the proposition to you that the so-called high bet that has been made by Ford on the Ford F-150 to manufacture those trucks with all aluminum, and to do it as a way to make sure that Ford can stay in compliance with the CAFE standards would not have occurred if there wasn't a great deal of confidence about the implications of this gas, the shale gas, shale gale availability, if you will, to provide them a belief that relatively competitive electricity, I won't say it's low cost, but competitive, globally competitive electricity, and what it means for aluminum, and therefore the availability of aluminum for that manufacturing process, such that Ford's strategy for complying in the out years with the CAFE standards, when you get into the next decade and the decade beyond that, this is a commitment they've made, and quite possibly are looking at even further utilization of aluminum as a way to reduce the vehicle weights and stay in compliance. It's not a 1 or 2 year tactical move. This is a long-term strategic move that wouldn't have even been considered, I submit, a half a decade ago, before we saw the availability of this gas supply. So this is a case where supply availability is, I think, going to become a powerful stimulus to downstream applications in the manufacturing process. Finally, and there'll be plenty of time for questions once I've wrapped this up, but basically, there's one other area that's gotten my attention, and I think it's an example of why there'll be more out-of-the-box thinking than I can summarize for you today, but it really got my attention when I came across it. GE, General Electric's, was mentioned earlier today in the embracing that they had for alternative fuels and wind and so on, and obviously that's still a meaningful component of their strategy. But one of the things that they've picked up on is, okay, it's interesting to think about LNG exports, and we're going to hear the case for that shortly, and I'm a big believer that that is part of the appropriate mix going forward. But the critics of it who would come forward and say, if you're just exporting your LNG, you're exporting something that could have a multiplier effect on value if it's used here domestically. And there is something to that argument, but the time frame to achieve that is such that I think the development of a meaningful component of gas exports is there. And most importantly, we need a pressure relief valve to keep the incentive out there to develop new gas supplies. If we were to have no gas exports, which is not being proposed, but just to understand why it's important, I cite this. If we had no gas exports, we're going to have a surplus in this country of a magnitude that the incentive to keep developing even more wells in the highly productive Marcellus would not be there. And already the development of the Marcellus has clamped back on Haynesville, Fayetteville, and others, as I suggested earlier. So GE has come up with an interesting strategy to come up with LNG on a modular, making LNG available in modular form, distributed form, if you will, which speaks to that security issue that we heard from Secretary Schultz, where you could have local stranded gas in certain portions of the country, and you could have these modular GE LNG units that could be available. And it's a variation to some degree, I believe, on what Noble's talking about right here in the Front Range, where they want to have an LNG facility. And I'm not sure if it meets quite the modular versus the idea of LNG exports, but the point is the oil and gas industry has embraced using LNG or other gas fueling in a variety of ways, as we heard from Jim Brown earlier today. And I think the importance of that is it's a new stimulus to manufacturing by GE of the way to create it in a way that can be distributed throughout the country. And when you start thinking about the amount of flaring of gas that's going on up in North Dakota, there could be applications there. When you think about other areas of the country, the Piceance Basin and other areas where if you've got an LNG on a modular basis available, the ability to use that and have it be probably cleaner than other fueling sources, and also from a security standpoint, not be totally linked to the grid in the way that the concerns that are now becoming evident about the vulnerability of the grid. Having the alternative to that will matter. And so those are some thoughts on the subject. I promised to have a little more time than I did on the last one, so Lynn, I'm ready for you if you are for me. Thank you very much.
Okay, so same rules as before. The folks will be circulating with cards. If you'd like to ask a question, please write it down and send it up, and we'll go from there. So again, while we're collecting, perhaps I could ask a question. At least in the utility industry, I have heard occasionally people still express worries about price volatility, partly because they're regulated in lots of different ways and it can be difficult to pass along price changes. But you said in your presentation that you thought there was that the markets were big enough now and that there was sufficient supply that there would be less price volatility. Yeah. You defend that to a utility executive?
I think I would, yes. Let me try to address why I think there is that perception and why I don't have it, why I don't share it to the same degree. First of all, the fear of price volatility on gas is that it wasn't that long ago that we had Rita and Katrina, 2005, and its after effects hit us for at least 3 years. And the result was $6 gas became $13, $14 per million BTU gas. That's a huge spike by any measure. And the memory of the last battle, if you will, is often in the mind, and I think that's there. What we have today with the diversity of supply that we've talked about is that crowd out that I mentioned for the Haynesville is a good example, where the Marcellus has become so economically superior, it's crowded out the Haynesville and the Fayetteville. Well, those reserves have not gone away, and by most studies that I'm aware of and most calculations, at somewhere between $5 and $6 gas, Haynesville becomes pretty attractive. At $6 and $6.50, Fayetteville becomes powerfully attractive. And the same can be said for about another half dozen of these, what we might call tier 2 sources that have the main reason for drilling them after we saw how big the Marcellus became was to make sure you establish held by production status on the leases. We're pretty well through that. So most of the rest of that is proved, undeveloped, and probable reserves that can be brought forth and will be brought forth on a price movement up to that. I don't rule out a price movement from what's been $3.50 to $4 recently. With this cold winter, it's been up there around $5, at least briefly, but is still expected to go back to maybe $4.50 or a little lower this year. Can $4.50 become $5.50 or $6? Yes. Will that bring out more supply? You betcha. Barring a huge natural event or some terrible other event, not so natural, man-made, I don't see how we get back to prices of that magnitude. Now, One argument that may come up on that same subject, and then I'll go to the next question. There are those who fear that when we start exporting, we're going to reconnect to the global market. Everything I've seen, and I think David Montgomery will speak to this more than me, I think he really studied this. I don't think the price effects from the amount of exports that we're likely to see in this decade or maybe well into the next one is likely to take prices much beyond the bands that I've talked about. David, correct me if I'm wrong, please.
So lots of questions here. This I think will be a short one, and then I'll group some of these others together.
I'll try to keep the answers short.
So do you see, is there a significant push from the automobile industry itself to work on natural gas vehicles, or is that coming from those who want to sell the natural gas?
There's probably more interest on those who want to sell the gas. The big problem is it's a chicken and egg problem. The delivery infrastructure is expensive, and you can't really get market penetration without it in place. And so, no, I see that working best, and we're going to have another speaker on that who knows a lot.
Yep.
But I think I'm going to listen with a tuned ear to what he says. I think the fleet conversion is the big opportunity. Then off of that, in a later cycle, will be extensions of that.
So, and just a quick follow-on from another questioner. So I think I would interpret that to mean that you see that as having a modest impact on the market as a whole, and not changing the overall picture of years of reserves.
In this decade, longer term, given decades and decades of good gas availability that we have, it may begin to change, but I'll be an old man, I think, before it happens.
Okay.
I'm only semi-old now.
So here's a question that comes from a different angle. So I'll use this one because I think it's interesting. So you talked about the possibility in one of the talks about it was still possible to destroy capital by making unwise investments. And so this question asks about whether there's been capital destruction in the coal industry and the economic effects of on that sector of replacing with natural gas.
Well, there probably has. I'm not an analyst of the coal sector, so I can't speak with great authority, but without question, there could be some. So far, what I perceive to have happened here is that the markets for coal have shifted overseas. We haven't had, we can be proud of the fact that we're back to a level on CO2 emissions that's in the early 90s. But we can't really claim that we've helped the globe that much yet, because most of the coal, I think, is being shipped to other markets where it is being burned, and we all breathe the global air. So we've got to work on that one still.
Yeah. So I got lots of questions here.
And the other point while you're doing that, the capital, so I don't think there's a lot of capital destruction for coal yet, because they had to shift to a different market. Maybe they got a lower net back out of that, but it wasn't total wipeout.
Okay, so I'm gonna ask this question, but then I'm going to allow you to defer until the next speaker, because I think some of this will come up. Should the U.S. government cap the volume of natural gas exports, or allow demand to drive volumes? I know that question is out there, so we'll leave that one in your mind, and we can come back.
I think David's well equipped to speak to that.
I know that's coming. So how about? So here's a question about interaction between gas markets and oil markets. Given the increase in natural gas, why wouldn't oil prices decline to $60 or so per barrel? And if this happened, how would the large companies respond?
Well, I don't think we have enough interaction for that to become a real threat, at least not in this decade. Somewhere out, maybe the world will change. But also, OPEC is not a non-factor here. And OPEC, if oil goes to $60 a barrel, two things happen. One, the economics of developing the biggest new source in terms of reserves is the Bakken. Most of the Bakken development is marginally economic. The core of the Bakken is marginally economic, and the greater Bakken is uneconomic at that kind of price. So it's not a sustainable long-term condition. Furthermore, the fear I mentioned earlier of OPEC deciding to drive the price down is a temporary measure. It's a warning shot. It's not the new norm.
Well, I see that you've timed perfectly that answer to come to the end of our time period, so thank you very much.